Hate is a waste of energy. I prefer the cold efficiency of justice. My mother-in-law, Martha, was a woman who weaponized her Christian values to mask a parasitic obsession with my daughter. She moved into my estate after her second divorce, penniless and bitter, and immediately set about the work of my erasure. She labeled me an unfit mother because of my struggle with bipolar disorder, a condition she tried to treat with forced prayer and public humiliation, as if my biochemistry could be scolded into submission. She thought she was the architect of my downfall, but she was actually just the catalyst for my restructuring. She manipulated my husband into filing for divorce and demanding full custody, citing my instability as the reason for the move she planned for them. While I was in a high-end private clinic getting my levels corrected by the best specialist money could buy, she was already packing my daughter's bags for Ireland. She leaned over me with a predatory smile and told me to stop crying and enjoy the little time I had left. She assumed that because I was quiet, I was defeated. She miscalculated. I wasn't crying. I was waiting for my blood levels to stabilize and for my lawyer to finalize the trap. I was done being a patient to be managed. I was becoming a power to be reckoned with. While they prepared to move abroad, I was reviewing the financial records and activating family leverage they didn't know existed. I didn't just want to get better. I wanted to take back the narrative. Before we continue with the restructure, let me know in the comments. Have you ever had someone try to use your health against you? I want to hear your stories. The prevailing wisdom in our society is that when someone hurts you, you should seek forgiveness to find peace. I find that perspective to be dangerously inefficient. Forgiveness is for the weak who lack the resources to enforce boundaries. I prefer the quiet, surgical peace of total irrelevance. As I sat in the glass-walled sunroom of the clinic, watching the mountain fog roll in, I wasn't meditating on letting go. I was meditating on optimization. For years, Martha and my husband had used my bipolar diagnosis as a cage. They spoke about my episodes in hushed, pitying tones at dinner parties, effectively gaslighting me into believing that my own mind was a faulty engine. I had lived in a state of perpetual apology, trying to make up for a chemical imbalance I hadn't asked for. But under the care of world-class neurobiologists, that narrative dissolved. I realized that my condition wasn't a character flaw. It was a data point. And like any data point in a complex system, it could be managed, stabilized, and used as a source of high-octane focus. While Martha was back at my house telling my daughter that mommy is sick in the head, I was undergoing a total systemic upgrade. My medication was fine-tuned with the precision of a Swiss watch. My sleep cycles were regulated. My emotional baseline was solidified into a bedrock of cold, clear logic. I stopped crying the moment I realized that my instability was the only weapon they had against me. If I removed the instability, I removed their leverage. Crying, Martha saw, wasn't grief. It was the final shedding of my old apologetic self. I began to view my life through the lens of a corporate restructuring. Martha was a toxic asset, a parasitic interloper who had overstayed her welcome. My husband was a compromised executive who had allowed a hostile takeover of his own family. And my daughter was the primary interest that needed to be protected at all costs. I didn't want to forgive Martha for trying to steal my child. I wanted to make her irrelevant. I wanted to reach a state where her voice was nothing more than background noise in a life she no longer had the clearance to enter. I wasn't just getting better for my health. I was getting better for the kill. My self-confidence wasn't just returning. It was being upgraded to a version that was reinforced with steel and clinical data. They thought they were sending me away to be fixed. They didn't realize they were sending me to a boot camp for the person who was about to dismantle their entire world. To understand Martha's endgame, you have to understand the specific brand of desperation that fuels a fallen matriarch. Martha didn't come to me out of love. She came to me because she had run out of people to manipulate. After her second divorce, she was left with a depleted bank account and a social circle that had grown weary of her performative holiness. She had spent 40 years being the center of attention in her small-town parish, and she couldn't stomach the thought of an anonymous life in a 2-bedroom apartment. She looked at my estate, a sprawling property passed down through my family, funded by generations of strategic investments, and she saw her retirement plan. When she first arrived, she played the role of the grieving mother. She spoke of her heartbreak, her spiritual journey, and her desire to be close to her only granddaughter. I, in my pre-optimized state, felt a sense of familial duty. I gave her the guest wing. I gave her a generous monthly stipend. I gave her a seat at my table. I mistook her presence for support. She mistook my generosity for a weakness she could exploit. The Christian values she touted were a thin veneer for a deep-seated narcissism. She began by making small, passive-aggressive comments about my parenting. "Oh, Elena," she would sigh, watching me prepare a bottle. "I just worry that with your condition, you aren't providing the spiritual fortress our little girl needs. A child needs a mother who is steady, not someone who is constantly at the mercy of her moods." She didn't stop at comments. She began intervention sessions. She would invite her friends from the local prayer group over, women who smelled of lavender and judgment, and they would surround me in my own living room. They would place their hands on my shoulders and pray for the demons of instability to leave my body. It wasn't about faith. It was about public humiliation. It was about establishing a record in front of witnesses that I was broken. My husband, David, was the weakest link in the chain. He had been raised under Martha's thumb, and while he had managed to find professional success, he had never developed the emotional backbone to stand up to her. Martha knew exactly which buttons to push. She convinced him that my bipolar disorder wasn't a manageable medical condition, but a ticking time bomb. "David," she would whisper to him in the kitchen while I was upstairs resting. "Look at her. She's erratic. She's dangerous. What happens if she has a break while you're at work? What happens to your daughter? You have to be the hero here. You have to save your child from her own mother." By the time I realized the extent of the conditioning, the trap was already being set. Martha had convinced David that they needed to start fresh in a stable environment, away from my family's influence and away from the toxicity of my medical history. They chose Ireland. It was far enough to be in exile, but close enough to Martha's idealized version of a traditional conservative society. What they didn't account for was the source of our lifestyle. They lived in my house, they spent my family's money. Even David's career growth was largely tethered to the corporate connections my father had spent 30 years cultivating. Martha assumed that because I was the one with the diagnosis, I was the one who was powerless. She viewed my medical records as a liability that would sink me in court. She didn't realize that in the world of high-stakes litigation and corporate law, a well-managed diagnosis is just a variable. The real liability was a parasitic mother-in-law with no assets and a documented history of domestic interference. Martha spent years trying to erase my presence from my daughter's life, teaching her that her mother was fragile and unwell. She spent years trying to gaslight me into believing that my biochemistry made me a danger to the people I loved. She thought she was building a case for my downfall. In reality, she was just documenting the very behavior that would eventually prove her to be a domestic interloper. She thought she was the architect. She thought she was the one with the direct line to a higher power. But as I sat in that clinic, reviewing the history of her prayers and her interventions, I realized she wasn't a saint. She was a squatter. And I was done being the landlord for a woman who was trying to burn the building down. The betrayal wasn't a single act. It was a slow-motion heist. While I was struggling with a medication adjustment that had left me temporarily lethargic, Martha and David were moving through my home like scavengers. They weren't just planning a move, they were planning a disappearance. I discovered the Ireland plot by accident. I had walked into the nursery to find Martha folding my daughter's clothes into heavy-duty shipping crates. Not suitcases, crates. "What are you doing, Martha?" I asked, my voice thick from the sedatives I was then taking. She didn't even look up. She kept folding a small wool sweater with terrifying serenity. "We're preparing for the future, Elena. A future where this child isn't subjected to the ups and downs of a broken household. David has been offered a magnificent position in Dublin, a fresh start, away from all of this." "Dublin?" I whispered. "I haven't agreed to a move." That was when David walked in. He wouldn't look me in the eye. He stood behind his mother like a loyal footman. "It's for the best, Elle. My mother is right. You need time to get right. We're going to head over there, get settled, and once you've finished whatever treatments you need, we can discuss visitation." "Visitation?" The word felt like ice water. "In my own home?" "It's not your home anymore, Elena," Martha interjected, finally looking at me. Her eyes were hard as marbles. "David is filing for divorce tomorrow. He's citing your medical instability as the basis for sole legal and physical custody. We've already spoken to the parish council. They've provided statements regarding your outbursts during our prayer sessions. You are in no position to fight this." They had it all mapped out. David would take a high-level executive role at a firm in Dublin, a firm that, ironically, had a deep partnership with my family's holding company. They assumed I was too foggy to make that connection. They assumed I was too weak to pick up the phone. The following morning, the recommendation came. Martha had found a wonderful private clinic. She framed it as a gift, a place for me to heal while they handled the stressful logistics of the move. It was a tactical removal. They wanted me behind locked doors while they boarded a plane. When the car arrived to take me to the clinic, Martha leaned into the window. The smell of her floral perfume felt like a physical assault. "Stop crying, Elena," she hissed, her voice dripping with a sickening faux maternal pity. "Enjoy the little time you have left to think of yourself. Once we're in Ireland, the courts will see that a stable, God-fearing grandmother is a much better influence than a mother who can't even control her own nerves. You've lost. Just accept it." As the car pulled away, I watched them standing on the steps of my estate, the house my grandfather built. They looked like the owners. They looked victorious. Martha was already holding my daughter's hand, waving it at me like a final goodbye. I didn't argue. I didn't scream. I leaned my head back against the leather seat and closed my eyes. Martha thought she had sent me to a cage where I would wither away in a haze of lithium and prayer. She didn't realize she had just paid for me to have 24-hour access to legal counsel, high-speed internet, and a team of doctors whose only job was to make me the most dangerous version of myself. The betrayal was complete. The exile had begun. But they had forgotten the first rule of war. Never let your enemy retreat to a place where they can regroup, rearm, and recover. The most insidious part of Martha's strategy wasn't the legal threat. It was the psychological erosion. She knew that to take my daughter, she first had to make me believe I didn't deserve her. This was the conditioning. a systematic attempt to replace my self-perception with her distorted, unfit narrative. Martha used my estate as a stage for my public shaming. She began organizing what she called support circles. She would invite members of her congregation over for tea, and while I sat there, she would treat me like a specimen in a jar. "It's the chemical imbalance," she would tell them, loud enough for me to hear from the next room. "She tries so hard, poor thing, but she just lacks the spiritual fortitude to stay level. Sometimes she's so manic she's practically vibrating, and other times, well, we've all seen the darkness she sinks into. It's a heavy cross for David to bear." She was building a file of witnesses. Every time I showed a spark of healthy anger at her overstepping, she would tilt her head, widen her eyes, and whisper, "Elena, dear, you're getting elevated again. Do we need to call the doctor? You're frightening the child." It was a master class in gaslighting. If I was happy, I was manic. If I was tired, I was depressed. If I stood my ground, I was unstable. There was no room for a normal human emotion because Martha had pathologized my entire personality. The conditioning extended to my daughter. I would catch Martha whispering to her, "Mommy's brain is a little broken right now, sweetie. She doesn't mean to be scary, she just can't help it. That's why Grandma is here to keep you safe." She was teaching my child to fear me, to view me as a glass figurine that could shatter at any moment. But the final act of conditioning was the prayer of submission. A week before they sent me to the clinic, Martha gathered the entire household in the foyer. She made me sit in the center of a circle while they prayed for my deliverance from the demons of the mind. She stood over me, her hand pressing firmly onto the top of my head, and prayed for David to have the strength to do what was necessary to protect the family from the instability within these walls. She wanted me to feel small. She wanted me to feel like a liability. She wanted me to believe that my only path to salvation was to step aside and let her take the reins. "You're a danger to her, Elena," she whispered in my ear afterward, her voice a cold, sharp blade. "Even you know it. Deep down, in your quiet moments, you know she's better off without you." She thought she had successfully broken my spirit. She thought the unfit label had finally stuck. But as I sat in that circle, listening to their rhythmic chanting and Martha's predatory prayers, I wasn't feeling broken. I was feeling a cold, crystalline clarity. I realized that if Martha was the definition of stable and God-fearing, then I wanted to be everything she wasn't. I wasn't a danger to my daughter. I was her only defense. The conditioning failed because Martha made one fatal mistake. She underestimated the high of a mother who has finally found her focus. The irony of Martha's plan was that she sent me to the one place where her influence couldn't reach, a high-end private medical facility funded by my own family's charitable trust. She thought she was discarding me in a warehouse for the mentally broken. In reality, she had handed me a fortified command center with 24-hour concierge service and a secure server. The first 3 days were dedicated to biological stabilization. I didn't resist. I leaned into the clinical data. Under the supervision of Dr. Aris, a neurobiologist who viewed bipolar disorder as a manageable electrical variance rather than a spiritual failure, we fine-tuned my regimen. Within 72 hours, the fog Martha had carefully cultivated with her gaslighting was gone. My mind was no longer a storm. It was a laser. Once my blood levels were optimized, I opened my laptop and began the restructuring. I didn't call David to beg. I called the managing partners of my family's venture capital firm. Martha and David had spent weeks celebrating his new executive vice president role at a prestigious Dublin firm. They thought it was a stroke of divine luck. They didn't realize that my family's holding company owned 15% of that firm's preferred stock and held 2 seats on their board of directors. I have a specific request regarding the relocation package for David, I told the lead director. I want the offer to proceed. I want the salary to be top tier, but I need the expatriate clause modified. The housing allowance and the tax-shielded bonuses must be legally contingent upon his residency in Ireland as a single individual. Any attempt to relocate dependents without written consent from the primary domestic estate, me, triggers an immediate breach of contract and a full clawback of the signing bonus. I wasn't stopping his move. I was ensuring that if he went to Ireland, he went as an exile, not a patriarch. Next, I met with my legal team in the clinic's private conference room. We didn't focus on feelings. We focused on the financial and medical timeline. The financial records. I pulled the statements for the stipend I had been paying Martha. It turned out the Christian woman had been funneling 40% of that money into a private account in Dublin, preparing a nest egg with my money for her life after she kidnapped my child. The surveillance. I had the house manager, a man whose loyalty I had earned long before Martha arrived, provide the logs of the prayer circles. We had timestamps of every time Martha had invited strangers into my home to perform interventions without my consent. The medical affidavit. Dr. Aris began drafting a 40-page clinical masterpiece. It didn't just say I was fine. It proved, through cognitive testing and longitudinal data, that my executive function was in the 98th percentile. It reframed my bipolar disorder as a condition that, when managed, provided a level of strategic resilience that far surpassed Martha's emotional interventions. I spent my evenings in the clinic's library, watching my daughter on the nursery's hidden nanny cam. I watched Martha tell her that Ireland is a place where we don't have to be sad anymore. I watched David sit in the corner, staring at his phone, a man who had sold his soul for a job title and his mother's approval. I didn't cry. I took notes. I was no longer the unstable wife they could push around with a Bible and a threat. I was the primary shareholder of my own life, and I was about to perform a hostile takeover of the narrative. Martha thought she had 3 weeks to pack the crates and disappear. She didn't realize that I had already filed the emergency stay of removal and the petition for special master to oversee the estate. The trap was set. My chemistry was perfect. My lawyers were hungry. And David's dream job in Ireland was about to become his gilded cage. Martha thought the clinic was the end of my story. She didn't realize it was the laboratory where I was building her replacement. The courtroom was not a place of mediation. It was my theater. I arrived at the courthouse in a charcoal gray power suit, my hair pulled back into a sharp, unforgiving knot. I wasn't the trembling, medicated ghost they had sent away to the clinic. I was a precision instrument. Martha and David were already seated at the petitioner's table. Martha was wearing a soft, lilac-colored dress, her godly grandmother uniform, and clutching a small leather-bound Bible. She looked at me with a smirk that suggested she thought I was out on a day pass. David wouldn't look at me at all. He looked like a man who had already spent his signing bonus in his head. When the judge entered, the atmosphere tightened. Martha's attorney began the assault. He spoke of my history, my volatility, and the heroic efforts of a family trying to protect a child from the unpredictable darkness of a bipolar mother. He presented the statements from Martha's prayer circle as if they were holy scripture. "Your Honor," the attorney said, gesturing to the crates currently waiting in my foyer, "the father has a magnificent opportunity in Ireland, a fresh start. This child deserves a life of stability, not a life lived in the shadow of a mother's chemical whims." Then it was our turn. My psychiatrist, Dr. Aris, took the stand. He didn't speak in platitudes. He spoke in data. He presented a digital display of my longitudinal blood levels, my cognitive test results, and my sleep cycle logs. Biological variance is not a character flaw, Your Honor, Dr. Aris said, his voice echoing with the authority of 30 years in neurobiology. The petitioner has successfully optimized her biochemistry. Her executive function, her ability to plan, reason, and manage complex systems, is currently in the 98th percentile of the population. To label her unstable is a biological fallacy. In fact, her level of self-monitoring makes her significantly more stable than the average parent. I watched Martha's face pale. The Bible in her hand tightened. Then, my lawyer dropped the hammer. He didn't just defend my mental health, he attacked the environment Martha had created. He played the audio from the nanny cam, the recording of Martha telling my daughter that my brain was broken. He presented the financial records showing the 40% stipend diversion to a secret Irish account. This is not a supportive grandmother, my lawyer declared. This is a domestic interloper. This is a woman who systematically gaslit a mother during a medical adjustment to facilitate what can only be described as a strategic kidnapping for financial gain. The judge leaned forward, her eyes narrowing as she looked at Martha. Mrs., did you or did you not organize intervention sessions with strangers in the respondent's home without her medical consent? Martha stood up, her lilac dress trembling. I was trying to save her soul. I was trying to protect the child from the demons. This is a court of law, not a parish hall, Mrs., the judge snapped. Sit down. Then came the final move, the corporate checkmate. My lawyer presented David's new employment contract from the Dublin firm. We are not seeking to block the father's career advancement, my lawyer said smoothly. However, the firm has already been notified that the relocation package, the housing, the travel, the executive perks, is legally tied to the father's status as a single expatriate. Any attempt to move the child would trigger a total breach of his contract. He is free to go to Ireland, but he goes alone. I looked at David. He looked like he had been struck. He realized in that moment that the dream life Martha had sold him was a trap. He had the job, yes, but he had no family to take with him and no house to return to. The judge didn't even retire to her chambers. She ruled from the bench. I find no evidence of the mother's inability to care for her child. In fact, I find the father and the paternal grandmother's actions to be a coordinated effort of psychological abuse and attempted custodial interference. Full physical and legal custody remains with the mother. The look on Martha's face when the verdict was read was worth every cent of my 6-figure legal fees. It wasn't just shock. It was the look of a parasite that had just been pulled into the light and realized it had nowhere to hide. I stood up, picked up my bag, and walked toward the exit. As I passed their table, I didn't stop. I didn't gloat. I simply looked at Martha and whispered 4 words. The audit is complete. The execution was flawless. The unstable mother had successfully restructured the estate, and the interloper was officially out of a job. The true beauty of a strategic trap is that the victim walks into it willingly, thinking they've won the lottery. David believed his promotion to the Dublin firm was his ticket to a new life as a powerful patriarch, free from my family's shadow. He didn't realize that I hadn't just allowed the job offer to happen. I had engineered its constraints. In the corporate world, we call this a gilded cage. 48 hours after the court ruling, David sat in my lawyer's office to sign the final separation and relocation documents. He looked defeated, his eyes darting toward the door as if he expected Martha to burst in and save him. But Martha was currently at home, frantically trying to find a lawyer who would take her case on contingency, a fruitless search given her lack of assets. You signed the contract, David, my lawyer said, sliding the employment addendum across the table. The firm in Ireland has finalized your relocation. You leave in 3 days. Your salary is significant, which is fortunate because your child support and alimony obligations have been calculated at the maximum threshold allowed by law. David looked at the numbers. This is nearly 60% of my take-home pay after taxes. How am I supposed to live in Dublin on the rest? The same way everyone else does, I said, speaking for the first time. By living within your means. You wanted a fresh start. You wanted to be the hero of your own story. Now you have the title to match. The reveal was the fine print of his expatriate package. Because I had activated my family's leverage on the board, his housing allowance was restricted to a 1-bedroom apartment near the office. There was no family villa in the countryside. There was no budget for a live-in grandmother. Most importantly, the contract included a morality and conduct clause. Any further attempt to disparage the primary shareholder, me, or interfere with custodial arrangements would result in immediate termination for cause. He was effectively exiled. He was being sent to a foreign country to work for a firm my family partially owned, to pay for a lifestyle he could no longer participate in. He wasn't a pioneer. He was a remote revenue stream for my daughter's trust fund. And my mother? David asked, his voice cracking. She has nowhere to go. She spent her savings on the Irish apartment deposit. Martha is no longer a factor in our financial planning, I replied. She is a guest in my estate until the end of the week. After that, she can seek divine providence, or find a rental she can afford on her own. I am sure her prayer circle can provide some spiritual support. I watched the realization sink in. He had traded his family for a title, and I had turned that title into a leash. He was going to Ireland, but he was going alone, to a life of cold offices and empty rooms, while I stayed in the home he tried to steal, thriving in the clarity he tried to call madness. The final confrontation didn't happen with a scream. It happened with a schedule. 3 days after the verdict, I returned to the estate. The crates were still in the foyer, but the shipping labels had been torn off. Martha was sitting in the formal dining room, the Bible still gripped in her hands like a life raft, waiting for a miracle that wasn't coming. David was already gone, headed to the airport in a rideshare I'd ordered for him, beginning his solitary trek to Dublin. I walked into the room, my heels clicking on the marble floors with a rhythmic, healthy authority. I didn't look like a woman who needed a support circle. I looked like the owner of the building. It's time to go, Martha, I said, not sitting down. The guest wing has been professionally cleaned and the locks have been cycled. Your bags are in the foyer. Martha looked up at me, her face a mask of righteous indignation. You think you've won, Elena? You've used your money and your doctors to buy a judge. But God sees the heart. He knows you're a broken vessel. You're depriving that child of the only stable, spiritual influence she has. Stability isn't a prayer, Martha. It's a practice, I replied. And as for depriving her, you'll still see her. I believe in family after all, just not on your terms. I slid a laminated sheet of paper across the table. It was the visitation protocol. You have been granted supervised visits, I told her, every second Saturday, 4 hours, here at the estate. There will be a professional monitor present, and the entire session will be recorded for the court. Martha's eyes darted over the paper. Every second Saturday? 4 hours? Like I'm some kind of criminal? Like you're a domestic interloper who attempted to facilitate a kidnapping, I corrected. And there are conditions. You are no longer allowed to speak of demons, addictions, broken brains, or prayer in my presence, or my daughter's. You will not pathologize my health. You will not attempt to indoctrinate her into your narrative of my instability. The moment you mention a chemical imbalance or try to perform a healing, the visit is terminated permanently. You're heartless, she whispered, her voice trembling with a rage she couldn't mask as piety anymore. You're a cold, arrogant woman. Your self-confidence is a sin. My self-confidence is an upgrade, Martha. It's the version of me you can never touch, because you can't gaslight a woman who has the data to prove you're a liar. I signaled to the house manager. He picked up her suitcases. Martha stood up, her lilac dress looking wrinkled and small in the vastness of the dining room. She had spent years trying to make me feel like a guest in my own life, and now she was being ushered out like an unruly patron in a high-end establishment. As she reached the door, she turned back, her mouth open for one last Christian rebuke. Don't, I said, raising a hand. Save it for the shelter you'll be living in if you don't find a job. You have 4 hours every 2 weeks to prove you can be a grandmother instead of a parasite. I suggest you use the time to practice silence. I closed the heavy oak door behind her. I didn't feel a rush of adrenaline. I felt the deep, resonant hum of a system that had finally purged its primary source of friction. The confrontation was over. The boundaries were set. The woman who tried to steal my life was now just a supervised guest in the lobby of it. The quiet in the estate is no longer the heavy, suffocating silence of a woman walking on eggshells. It is the clean, expansive silence of a gallery. 6 months have passed since the locks were changed and the exile began. The house feels different now. The air is lighter, the energy stabilized. Without Martha's constant low-frequency hum of judgment and David's weak-willed compliance, the property has returned to being a sanctuary rather than a battlefield. I am thriving. My daughter is thriving. We spend our mornings in the garden I've reclaimed, and our evenings in a home where the word unstable has been permanently deleted from the vocabulary. She is no longer told that her mother's brain is broken. She sees a mother who is the CEO of her own life, a mother who is the primary architect of their world. David is still in Dublin. His social media, which I monitor through a burner account for security purposes, is a pathetic mosaic of rainy streets and executive lunches he clearly can't afford. He is finding out that a high-level title is cold comfort when 60% of your paycheck is automatically diverted to the woman you tried to abandon. He sends emails occasionally, filled with a weak, lukewarm regret, but I don't reply. I don't need his apologies. I have his alimony. As for Martha, the Second Saturday protocol is a study in controlled humiliation. She arrives at 10 a.m. sharp, subjected to a security sweep and a reminder of the conduct rules by the professional monitor. She sits on the sofa, her Bible notably absent from her hands, and watches my daughter play. She is careful. She is quiet. She knows that I am watching the feed from my office, and she knows that one mention of prayer as medicine will result in her being escorted to the gate. The look on her face during these visits is my favorite part of the aftermath. It's the look of a woman who realizes she has been reduced to a footnote in a story she tried to co-author. She isn't the matriarch anymore. She is a supervised visitor in a house she once thought she owned. I didn't just get better. I took back the narrative. I am not a patient. I am the most stable force in my daughter's life. My self-confidence isn't just back, it's been upgraded to a version they can never touch. I didn't lose my family. I eliminated the liabilities. And for the first time in my life, the ledger is perfectly balanced. In my profession and in my life, I have learned that the greatest threat to a system isn't an external shock. It's an internal parasite. Martha and David didn't just want my child or my money. They wanted my reality. They wanted to rewrite my biology as a tragedy so they could play the heroes in the ruins of my life. They mistook my medical journey for a weakness and my silence for a surrender. But they forgot one fundamental law of physics. Stability isn't the absence of movement, it's the mastery of it. I don't wish to forgive Martha. Forgiveness is a luxury for those who can afford the risk of being hurt again. I prefer the peace of her total irrelevance. I have realized that you cannot pray away a toxic personality, but you can certainly litigate it out of your foyer. I didn't find myself in that clinic. I built a version of myself that was too expensive for them to maintain and too precise for them to manipulate. I am thriving in my home. My daughter is safe, and the woman who tried to steal my life is now just a supervised guest in it. I didn't lose my family. I eliminated the liabilities. I won. If you've ever had someone try to use your health, your past, or your instability as a weapon to keep you small, hit that like button. Let me know in the comments. What was the moment you stopped apologizing for your condition and started using it as your strength? Don't forget to subscribe. We don't do victims here. We do architects. I'm Elena, and this has been a successful restructuring.